Hello again, everyone. This is Professor Casey. Welcome back. Today we're discussing something that occurs in the middle portion of the 20th century, going forward into the present, an event that is known as post-colonialism, and subsequently we have post-colonial literature that occurs after this. Okay? This is not to be confused with the colonial era in the United States, not necessarily when the United States is first colonizing back in the 1700s, but really this is an event that occurs after, far after events like imperialism and the major world wars actually begin to occur. So this is something that occurs in the modern era, more specifically in the 20th century than in any other period in time. So the term post-colonial actually refers to a very unique situation relating to imperialism. Okay? And this is a situation in which a culture that has been colonized by an imperial culture is now torn between the native roots of the traditional culture and the culture of the colonizers. Okay? So this is a culture of some kind that has been colonized by an imperial culture, and this group that has been colonized is now torn between two different worlds. Okay? The traditional roots that their society comes from, and the culture of the people who have now colonized them. And this is not necessarily something that occurs within the first generation. Quite often, post-colonialism occurs several generations afterward, in which new generations are actually growing up with the colonizers in their faces, okay, so in their everyday lives. Okay? And so gradually over time, later generations become more and more removed from their traditional culture. Okay? And this is something, again, that occurs all the way into the present. Okay? Quite often in the United States, it has more to do with immigration. Okay? If you are from a first-generation immigrant family, okay, depending on how far removed you are, depending on how much cultural assimilation or adaptation has occurred over time, okay, sometimes you might have a family that stays very traditional. They might still speak their traditional native language in their houses. They might decorate or dress in traditional garb. Whereas in other instances, they might have completely adopted the culture, the language, the ways, the religion even of the place they have immigrated to. So this is a very similar type situation to that. The major difference here, though, between the immigrant situation and a post-colonial situation is that quite often, not always, but quite often, the immigrant situation is a little bit more voluntary. Okay, a family or a group has immigrated, perhaps voluntarily, perhaps not, to another place and has chosen or not to adopt a certain way. Post-colonialism is actually coerced. It's something that is very involuntary. It's something that is bullied into existence. It's something that is made to happen, quite often with threats of violence. And sometimes by the time post-colonialism has occurred, occasionally the colonial presence has up and left already and independence has been gained. Okay? Once we get into talking more about this in the history class, this might make a little bit more sense. But in an instance like India, for example, this is one of the biggest instances in the 20th century. India was controlled by the British for several decades, up until 1948, when it ends up gaining independence finally from the colonial presence of England. Okay? And England eventually cuts all ties and leaves. The colonial presence ends up leaving India, but a lot of the English culture is still in existence in India to a certain extent, okay? And ends up lingering after the fact. Okay, so this is an instance where colonialism has left, but the post-colonial atmosphere is still there. And quite often, post-colonial literature, and more often than not, incorporates power struggle and identity. Okay? And specifically the identity of the people who have been colonized, right? Do they have their own unique native culture still, or have they adopted the culture of the people who have come in and changed everything? So they're struggling quite a bit with that. Typically, the identity part comes in later generations. And the power struggle part typically comes within the first generation or two of the colonizers showing up. Okay? So you have people who actually might end up turning on one another, who end up becoming traitors, perhaps to their own culture in some people's eyes, okay, because they end up, hurting their fellow people in their own culture. And so this is where we get the dichotomy of nationalism and imperialism. Okay? Imperialism, of course, is where you have a major world power that is trying to control other cultures. Okay? And the nationalist response to that is for the culture that is subject to control trying to build up its own national identity, its own cultural identity again. Okay? And this is the dichotomy that actually began the First World War. Okay? We had the imperial presence of Austria-Hungary, and then we actually had the nationalist response to them encroaching on territories. And racism is something that is very, very prevalent in post-colonial literature, quite often because the imperial powers themselves tend to be overbearingly white cultures, okay, that come in and try to subjugate non-white cultures. Okay, so again, in the instance of India, for example, in several African nations, this has occurred. So it's a situation often when individuals are subject to a lot of oppression, in some cases violent murder, in some cases betrayal of one's own culture, of one's own people in the span of things. And there are two other terms that we can discuss here too. One is a French term that was used quite often in the 20th century. I don't know if it's really used that much anymore, called negritude. And this is basically it means a blackening, basically. And yes, this does have a racial connotation to it, to a certain regard, basically saying that, or trying to lump together cultures into one category, often by imperial groups, trying to lump several racial categories into one, saying that these people are quote-unquote undesirable. Okay? So again, in the instance of India, native Indians and Africans were quite often lumped together in the same category by whites. Okay? They're often very mistreated and so forth. And the concept of Pan-Africanism kind of goes along with this as well. It's a lumping together of several groups of tribes, rather than recognizing each individual tribe as unique in and of itself, right? Africa has hundreds of tribes with hundreds of languages, religions, and so forth, but just trying to lump it all together as African, okay, is an oversimplification at best. The Back to Africa movement is actually something that spawned out of this during the 1920s with Marcus Garvey, who we'll discuss in chapter 23. Marcus Garvey attempted to, he actually came across as being a con artist in the long run, but he attempted to repatriate African Americans back to Africa to begin a more modernized, African-led, black-led, black-controlled government in Africa. And it's something that, again, even gets put forward into the modern era, into literature, comic books, and entertainment with things like the Black Panther film, okay, Wakanda, and so forth. Okay, this is something that kind of is birthed out of that to a certain extent. Now, some terms to go along with post-colonialism, some words that you'll end up encountering if you ever end up taking a course on post-colonialism, or if you ever have a section on post-colonial literature in a major literary class. The concept of the other, or of othering, is something that we see often, time and time again throughout history, again, even into the modern day. It's usually given several different names, but it's basically alienation of another person or people. Okay? Basically saying, this person, we are this one group, but this other group of people over here, they're other people. Okay, they're people who are they're not like us. Perhaps they have a different language, different culture, different religion, and somehow one group considers the other group perhaps to be inferior. Okay? This is othering. Okay, it's marginalizing people quite a bit. Okay, and in social justice movements that we see in the 21st century now, this is being brought to light more and more and more. And people are starting to try to bridge the divide between those two things. But othering still takes place on a regular basis, right? It's the root of prejudice. Demonic othering is something where you have an actual hatred for another country or for another culture. Okay, so if there is demonic othering going on, that means that you are afraid of another group or that fear is associated with another group, and fear, of course, becomes hatred over time. And then, of course, we have something that is depicted as being more benign, but it can have just as many harmful repercussions as well. It's something called exotic othering, and it involves a lot of stereotyping, and stereotyping that ends up devolving into mystification and a lot of, I guess, flights of fancy. Okay, so one prime example of this is done in pulp fiction comics, the precursors to modern comic books during the 1920s. Okay, if you ever look at a pulp novel from that time period, typically it is a white man rescuing a white, often blonde, woman from an individual who is from an exotic culture. Okay? And by exotic, I mean Eastern, okay, in this particular case. Western culture, you have a hero and a damsel in distress, and then you have some sort of exotic, mystifying individual from another culture who is trying to exploit the woman somehow, right? Leave it to your imagination. And typically it is a person of color. Okay, it's a person of Asian descent, it is a person of African descent, something along those lines. Okay, and so again, this is something that the person is sometimes depicted as human, sometimes they are depicted as subhuman. Okay, even in comic books going into the 1950s, if you look at some of the Captain America comic book covers that I'll put into the discussion board for the history class, Captain America ends up fighting the communist enemies of the United States, and quite often they are individuals from China or from North Korea, and they are depicted as subhuman monsters. Okay, it's a very stereotypical image of an Asian person with fangs and all this other stuff added along. Okay, so again, this is exotic othering that is ends up becoming something more and more horrible. And again, sometimes this is made into something that is much less egregious, I should say, than what you see in the Captain America instance, for example. But even in something like there's I've used this in another class. There's a Simpsons episode, the Treehouse of Horror series that they do every Halloween, where they do a reenactment of the famous story, The Monkey's Paw. And Monkey's Paw is this. It's kind of like a magic lamp type thing. It's a mummified monkey's hand that ends up granting wishes that go horribly wrong. And in the Simpsons episode, you see exotic othering take place because when Homer Simpson gets the monkey's paw, he gets it from a Middle Eastern man, okay, who we don't know where this thing has come from. We don't know what power is imbued with it, how, when, why, any of that. All we know is it comes from an exotic source, from someone who is not from Springfield, where the Simpsons come from. Okay? Again, it's a passing, fleeting thing, and it's made to be comedic in the instance, but it's exotic othering taking place. Okay? And again, we see this happen all the time with characters, and it's something that gets glossed over quite a bit. Hybridity and syncretism are two other things that we can talk about here. Hybridity is when we have a hybrid of two cultures based on colonization. Okay, so like we talked about earlier with the combination of British culture and Indian culture, there is sometimes a crossover between the two that becomes almost a brand new culture in and of itself. Sometimes people refer to this as a pidgin or a Creole culture. Diaspora is another term we can hear from time to time. A diaspora is when you have a mass migration of a specific culture out of its homeland, whether it's an actual culture or an actual country that exists, or if it's a traditional location that then gets turned into kind of an abstract idea of a homeland. And sometimes, again, there is no shared homeland, but a shared ethnic identity where people end up just dispersing. Okay? Diaspora is a term that often gets used when it comes to perhaps the African slave trade, right? The African diaspora. The Jewish diaspora gets used quite often as well, especially in the period leading up to and immediately after the Second World War. There's a massive diaspora, massive migration of Jews leaving Europe in the face of Nazism and so forth. The idea of double consciousness, again, is something that goes along not just with post-colonialism, but also with immigration. It's the concept of having two culturally based minds in a single person. So sometimes people have a specific cultural identity that goes along with their own home culture, and then sometimes they have a second identity that they wear in a different culture. Okay, so for example, a family immigrating to the United States, again, they might speak their native language at home, they might wear traditional clothing, practice traditional religion and family values and so forth, and that's one identity. And then maybe if they go to work or if they do anything outside of their home, perhaps they do this, perhaps not, they might have a completely separate identity in order to quote unquote fit in. And again, it's something that is sometimes it's a conscious effort to do that, and sometimes not. Sometimes people just have one single identity. But in this particular case with post-colonialism, when I'm talking about that, it has typically to do with a colonial presence that is threatening them if they don't comply. So in the case of something like the British in India, for example, unless you abide by British laws and dress a certain way, carry an ID card, all these types of things, you could get in trouble. Okay, so this was the way things were at this particular point in time. Mimicry is one of the more terrible things that actually comes out of post-colonialism, because it's an effort by the colonized group to mimic the colonizers. Okay, so for example, if you have a group like the British or the French or the Belgians or something like that, who goes into, say, Africa during the 19th century, where a lot of groups are still living in a tribal lifestyle, having a tribal elder, perhaps, who wants to get on the side of the British or something like that, they start dressing in top hats and clothing and so forth, and it's an immediate abandonment of their own traditional identity in favor of something that a lot of other people realize they will not be. Okay, and again, it's often used as a I don't know if used is the correct term, but viewed sometimes as a form of ridicule by the colonizers. So think of something like a very stuffy British lord showing up in a tribal village, seeing a tribal elder dressed like him. He will never accept the tribal elder as being his equal. That's kind of the point. So it's and he might look at him and ridicule him for the way that he's dressed, that type of thing. So it's again, it has everything to do with the power struggle and identity aspect of this, but it's an effort to assimilate. And in some cases, it has to do with conversion to a new religion, dressing in different clothes, right, speaking a different language, and so forth. And mimicry, again, sometimes involves not just abandonment of native culture, but an open and active betrayal of a native culture. In other words, you might have a native who ends up turning in members of their own family because they don't assimilate, okay, or turning in their friends or something like that because they they broke the law of the colonizers, right? It's a major betrayal. So post-colonialism is not necessarily a happy genre for the most part. It's actually quite dark and very psychological. But it's, again, something certainly worth reading about. And two of the major examples of post-colonial literature that I can quote right here and now are the 1958 novel Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. Okay, this has to do with southeast Nigeria, okay, under colonial rule, and kind of the some of the examples I was talking about a minute ago, right, where you actually have a tribal group that is trying to decide whether they should assimilate to the ways of the colonizers or not. And then the other one is another very famous one from 1899 called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And this involves Belgium's control of Congo during the late 19th century for the diamond trade. Okay, a lot of slave labor, a lot of violence, and in particular, there's a spoiler alert. There's a British officer who goes rogue and actually begins to turn into a much more brutal local lord in and of himself. He starts to brutalize the slaves that he takes into his control. He actually decapitates several of them and puts their heads on spikes around his hut and so forth. Heart of Darkness actually became the basis for the film Apocalypse Now. Okay, so if you read one and then watch the other and so forth, you see a lot of parallels between the two. So anyway, these are all examples, and post-colonialism, like I said, continues into the present because there are still, in some cases, countries that are declaring independence from imperial rule in some regard. Most of the major imperial reversions back to independent status took place sometime in the mid-20th century, going into, in some cases, the 1970s, 1980s even. One or two instances, I believe, in the 90s. But this is something that is largely petered out, but there are still ramifications decades later. Okay, so it's something worth taking note of. If you ever encounter it, you will be able to recognize it when you see it. Right? So that's all I got for you for today on post-colonialism. If you're a student of mine, head on over to the quiz section and take your quiz on post-colonialism. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you next time.